Hi, good morning. Welcome to our session on content moderation. Hello to everyone who's here today early in the morning and folks who are joining us on Zoom. My name is Akriti Gaur. I'm a GSD candidate at Yale Law School and a resident fellow with the Yale ISP. I have the privilege of moderating this session with all my wonderful co-panelists here. We have Yohannes Ayalew, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law, Monash University, Australia, and he's also a PhD affiliate at the Kastan Center for Human Rights. And we have Endalk Chala, who is an experienced trust and safety professional and translator with an instructional design background and a PhD in media studies from the University of Oregon. He's an assistant professor at Hamline University and a researcher now with the Analysis and Response for Trust team. And we also welcome Sarah Fisher and Jeffrey Howard. Sarah is a research fellow in philosophy at the University College London. Before coming to UCL, she worked at the University of Vienna. Jeffrey is an associate professor of political philosophy and public policy at UCL and a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford University. Sarah and Jeffrey work together at the Digital Speech Lab at the University College London. Before we proceed with all the wonderful presentations and the discussions, some housekeeping notes. Each of your talks will be roughly 15 minutes each, and we'll be keeping the time. And after that, we'll have a discussion and open it up to all of you in the audience. So, Yohannes, you can begin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yohannes Ayalew. I recently completed my PhD just last week. So, yeah. So my talk will be on blind spots in platform content moderation in Ethiopia. So, my presentation has the following outline. After providing some context, I will set the theoretical framework, and then I will showcase the ways in which platform content moderation have created kind of linguistic and context blind spots in Ethiopia in 3 case studies that I have researched. And then I will show what are these peculiar blind spots in content moderation, and then where do we go from here as the problem is not adequately addressed. To give a little bit of context, in Ethiopia, like the internet penetration is still low. The recent data from the Ethio Telecom shows that only 28.4% of individuals have access to the internet in Ethiopia, which means over 35 million people in Ethiopia have access to the internet. Still, compared to the total population, the digital divide remains wide. And the other context that we need to understand while discussing content moderation is that in Ethiopia, we have so many platforms, including the major platform Facebook. We have over 8.5 million Facebook users in total. And the other context that should be underlined while discussing content moderation is that there has been a conflict. Of course, there is an ongoing conflict and ethnic divides in the country. So after setting this context, my theoretical framework is based on decolonial and critical approaches. Basically, I try to surface the discussion of content moderation within the third-order approach to international law. And by taking the African human rights system as a case study, I will also discuss the theoretical issues, because the third-order approach is important here, as the project of Majority World Initiative is also more on bringing vocal and critical voices to the fore. So I feel the third-order approach to international law is important for one thing to deconstruct the ways in which international human rights law creates a kind of hierarchy and a kind of individualistic conception of human rights. So that's why I'm focusing on these critical approaches. And I also use some of critical scholars like the works of Mutua and others. So to look into those three case studies, the first case study that I discussed in this presentation is the October violence in 2019. What was happened was the well-known Ethiopian political figure. He was also known as, I think, Gaur Mohammed. He took on Facebook and posted in Amharic, "ተከብቤያለሁ," which literally means I am under siege. Following this post, his followers were marched toward this the capital, as well as in different parts of Oromia and Addis Ababa, and then they just kind of posed some sort of violence, and as a result of this October violence, 86 people were killed. And one of the reasons that content moderation in the Ethiopian context is considered as a broken promise was that, like, Facebook was sluggish to take action and to take it down, that content. As a result, of this event, it exposed the gaps in Facebook's content moderation efforts, and it shows us like the failure of platforms like Meta and Facebook basically to hire enough content moderators who are fluent in local languages such as Amharic, Afan Oromo, and other languages. And here I'm not just kind of showing the criminal responsibility or liability of the person who makes a speech, rather, how platforms are insensitive toward such kind of content. In other case studies like Myanmar, establishing criminal responsibility for those who post on Facebook is said to be a bit difficult and a bit rigorous because it requires a kind of high threshold evidence to prove criminal responsibility in those cases. So in my study, I only showcase how the post by the well-known activist and politician, resulted in, the killing of 86 people, which is in part the result of Facebook's failure to take action timely. The other, following this October violence, the Ethiopian government took action, and the parliamentarians were very much vocal to have a law that punishes and prevents viral hate speech and disinformation. And the government enacted Proclamation 1185, 2020, to prevent and suppress hate speech and disinformation. And one of the key additions in this law is that the responsibility of social media institutions and service providers, and it requires, especially under paragraph 2 of Article 8, social media service providers should act within 24 hours to remove or take out of the circulation disinformation or hate speech upon receiving notifications about such communication or post. So this is somehow, taken from the German's Network Enforcement Act, the 2017 German's Network Enforcement Act. But unfortunately, this law hasn't enforced yet. We don't have, strong institutional, ability to enforce this proclamation. But following the October violence, the government also was in a direction of, legislating a law to punish and suppress hate speech. And the second context that I looked those blind spots of platforms is that the social media-led atrocities in the aftermath of Ayalew Hundessa murder back in 2020. This is also another important political development in the Ethiopian recent political history. What was happened was the assassination of the famous singer Ayalew Hundessa on the 29th June 2020. And then following his murder, there was proliferation of ethnic hate speeches and call for violence on popular social media platforms such as Facebook and YouTube. And such terms like hate speech, terms like naftanya, neo-naftanya, kill naftanya, or things like that were viral on social media, and especially the fans of the artist were a bit vocal and a bit propagating impassioned messages on YouTube to kind of kill those who are labeled as naftanya, neo-naftanya, or other kind of designations, which are said to be illegal under Ethiopian law. As a result of this event, over 239 people were killed. And in the end, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, the well-known NGO, civil society on human rights, issued a statement, Ethiopia on the edge of genocide, which also calls how this event resulted in kind of crime against humanity on those minorities living in Oromia and in the southern part of Ethiopia. So, which is something interesting beyond content moderation discussion as well. But this event also exposed how platforms are, inactive, while an active call for violence was there. And following this event, academia, people from academia and civil society were vocal and trying to petition Facebook, and they sent open letter to Facebook on violence inciting speech. And I was also co-signatory of this letter. And in this letter, we demanded Facebook to kind of add significant resource to right respecting content moderation effort by recruiting a sufficient number of content reviewers that have the required skills in all languages spoken in Ethiopia. And the other demand we asked was make content reporting on Facebook services in low resource languages. Before this event, Facebook service was provided only in English, but later on, other languages have, platform language services as well. The third case study that I'm looking very quickly is the war in northern Ethiopia, which was concluded in 2022. As you might have known, this conflict also exposed how social media platforms were not in a position to respond to, content that was creating violence and discrimination against minorities. In this conflict, there was competing narrative by warring parties, the supporters of the government as well as the opposition, the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, were engaged in competing narratives on the social media, and as a result, there was vilification of ethnic Tigrayans, to a degree Amharas and Afars as well. As a result of this, viral hate speech were disseminated on social media. Just an example, there are dozens of hate speeches in this Tigray conflict, but one activist was saying, let's put Tigrayans, ethnic Tigrayans, even if those who have no connection with TPLF, into temporary concentration camps. This was viral, and it was not taken down until an email was sent to Facebook to remove this content. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is also a call for violence against Amharas who were labeled as donkeys, or who are labeled as, with animals and dehumanizing words as well. So basically, from these case studies, I found the following blind spots. The first thing is platforms, including Facebook, are insensitive to local context, especially in a country we have over 92 languages, and we have also a complicated web of ethnic and religious fault lines. So platforms are not in a position to articulate what's going on in the country with ethnic diversity and religious diversity. Very recently, even platforms lack policy or rules on emergent forms of hate speech. There is also an ongoing war in Amhara region in Ethiopia. In that region, recently, government officials are using terms like Jawisa, which is something to label the Amharas, but there is no policy or rule that, discourage or that prohibits this kind of hate speech. The second blind spot I found is that there is little or no investment in tools and moderators addressing these gaps. One of the report by Council of Foreign Relations found that only the number of content moderators for Ethiopia Amharic content is only 5, which is something compared to the number of users. This is insignificant. There is also lack of transparency, and recently platforms like Meta have started large language models, especially AIs on low resource languages in the majority world, but it's found to be this intervention is inadequate because the algorithms were not trained well in those low resource languages. The third blind spot that I found is that there is a platform epistemic injustice in a way that the modus operandi for content moderation is based on international human rights law, which is articulated under Article 19 of the ICCPR, which also lacks or neglects collective conception of human rights. So I think Meta, for example, omits these laws which are said to be un-African. For example, the corporate human rights policy of Meta mentions all regional human rights, including the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, and the Fundamental Charter of European Union, and also other internationally accepted human rights. But it fails to mention the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is important instrument to articulate the communal conception of human rights. So this shows us these platforms are ignoring subaltern epistemic laws, jurisprudences, and locations as well. The other final comment that I also highlighted earlier is that the current framework of content moderation is based on international human rights law under the ICCPR framework, which invisibilizes and often ignores users in the global south, because the international human rights law is based on individualistic conception, which was created in the colonial encounter. Through that encounter, the very idea of content moderation is discussed. So I'm calling here, in the future discussions, we need to consider, the existing system is a bit narrow in scope, arguably Eurocentric and individualistic in its focus. So we need to kind of consider alternative frameworks such as the African approach to content moderation, which is based on communal conception of human rights as articulated in African human rights law. And the other finding is Facebook has shirked its due diligence responsibility in those 3 contexts that I highlighted earlier. Finally, platforms like Facebook should consider the concerns of underrepresented voices from the majority world countries such as Ethiopia. This includes actions such as diversifying content and policy team and hiring of enough content moderators, as well as a timely training of AI on emergent hate speech, propaganda, and misinformation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Yohannes, and congratulations on completing the PhD last week. I hope you got some time to celebrate. We have Sarah and Jeffrey next. Yeah, hopefully you can see me peeking out from behind this big screen here.
Good. Hi, I'm Sarah Fisher. I'm based at the Digital Speech Lab at University College London, and I'm going to be talking today about moderating misinformation and specifically the challenge of generative AI. And of course, I got some generative AI to create me an image for this presentation, and here it is. It's a little odd if you look closely, as with a lot of these AI-generated images, but well, it's kind of fun. So I'm presenting on behalf of the three co-authors of this paper. So the others being Jeff, who's sitting next to me, and also Beatrice Kira, who couldn't be here, but is another member of the Digital Speech Lab. So we've already started to see generative AI feature in some electoral politics around the world in the last few months. So back in the autumn in Slovakia, there was a deepfake audio released just before the election, which appeared to portray a politician chatting with a journalist about committing electoral fraud. And because this was done during a moratorium period in the day or two before the election, it was quite difficult for people to debunk it. In the end, the other party won, unclear whether this played any role in that. Also, in the Argentinian election, we saw both sides, both camps using AI-generated images. In Indonesia, we heard from some colleagues in the conference specifically about the AI-generated media that was used in that election. In the US and also in the UK, there have been audio and video deep fakes of political leaders, including prominently the Biden robocalls so-called, which happened during the New Hampshire primary election, where people were ostensibly called up by Biden and encouraged not to vote. So I think we can expect that synthetic contents of these kinds are going to keep playing a role in this bumper year of elections that we've got right now and also beyond. And some of that content is going to constitute harmful mis- or disinformation, which poses a threat specifically to our democratic institutions. And this is what we're particularly interested in this paper. So it could be fakes of politicians or political candidates appearing to do things that they didn't actually do. It could be falsehoods about election processes or about policy issues, which affect people's ability to deliberate and participate properly in the process. And so that's the kind of content that we're particularly worried about. And now, coupled with that, social media platforms are content distribution networks par excellence. So this is where the real damage is going to be done when this kind of content gets to go viral. Now, on the one hand, you might think, well, action being taken by AI companies themselves upstream of social media can reduce the amount of content, of harmful content that's being produced at source in the first place. For example, by training these models and algorithms, fine-tuning them in advance of releasing them to the public, and also by adding some kind of filters, system prompts, other guardrails that kind of manage how people are using them once they've been released. But I think it's pretty clear that these kind of actions, while important, are not going to completely eliminate harmful content from being produced. And that's due to technological limitations. We don't really understand how these things are working anyway. And the guardrails are easy sometimes or possible to jailbreak. And then there's also potential non-compliance by especially some of the smaller companies that are releasing these kind of applications. So there's already now lots of different applications on the market that can be used and misused in all sorts of different ways. And as I said, whatever bad content does end up getting produced, it's going to get spread predominantly through social media, potentially reaching vast audiences that way. And so we think that platforms have to tackle this as well. They must combat the spread of harmful synthetic content. But the question is, what exactly should they do? So what rules should social media platforms enact in relation to this harmful synthetic content that we expect might come on the scene? And of course, the kind of nuclear option is to just ban it altogether and try to not allow people to post any AI-generated content at all. And that's an option that we do consider in the paper and reject for various reasons. What we think is a more tempting option for the platforms is to think that they need a wholly new set of rules about what synthetic content is allowed and what is disallowed. And indeed, this is the way that some of the major players have already started to go, with specific policies on manipulated or synthetic media. But in fact, we think this approach is largely misguided. So let's home in specifically on Meta's manipulated media policy. According to this policy, it prohibits content where the manipulation is not apparent. So it's not obvious, it's not blatant. It also prohibits that content when it's in video format specifically. So the policy only applies to manipulated videos. It's prohibited when it would likely mislead an average person to believe that a subject of the video said words that they did not say. So very specifically about what the subject says. And finally, it's only prohibited if the content is the product of artificial intelligence or machine learning, not other technologies. But we might ask, with regards to the first point, what does it mean for a manipulation to be apparent? Apparent to whom is probably going to depend somewhat on the audience, whether it's apparent. And we might worry that even really obvious fakes leave some kind of lingering psychological effects. And this is an empirical question, which I think is not settled in the psychological community. Regarding the second point, it seems overly narrow to restrict the policy to video. Why only video? What about images, audio, text? Regarding the third point, why only focus on the subject's words and whether they said what they appear to have been saying? What about other actions or events that they might have been performing, or even events that don't have a subject but are fabricated? And with regard to the final point, why only consider content when it's produced by artificial intelligence on machine learning? What about other technologies? So regarding this last point in particular, Meta's oversight board recently took a case regarding a piece of content where there was a video that was edited to make it appear as though Joe Biden, the US president, is inappropriately touching his adult granddaughter's chest. So it's quite a nasty piece of content. And Meta had left this piece of content up on their platform, but it was referred to the oversight board to consider. Now, the oversight board ruled that the content didn't violate the company's manipulated media policy, so they were right in that sense not to take it down, because the clip doesn't show President Biden saying any words at all. And it wasn't altered using these new generative AI technologies. But surely this just goes to show the problem with their kind of sui generis manipulated media policy. And that's exactly what we in the Digital Speech Lab argued in a submission that we sent in to the Oversight Board as evidence on this case. And it turns out that they agreed with us, which was very nice. And so the Oversight Board found that Meta's manipulated media policy is lacking in persuasive justification. It's incoherent, confusing to users, fails to clearly specify the harms it's seeking to prevent. So in short, the policy should be reconsidered. And so we agree with that, and we think it points to a wider principle. Specifically, we argue that platforms should enact the same rules for AI content as for other content. After all of these platforms are already in the business of moderating misinformation or trying to do so. So Meta, YouTube, TikTok, even X, formerly Twitter, all say at least that they restrict some harmful misinformation that's posted by users. And they use a combination of bans and removals of content and demotions of the less harmful stuff. And to be sure, generative AI supercharges that misinformation problem. We don't want to deny that. It does so because it really greatly facilitates the production of convincing fabrications, not just for those people who are deliberately going out of their way to produce propaganda, but also because fabricating is kind of the essence of what they do. It's their modus operandi. And so when you're interacting with these things, they're quite likely in many circumstances to give you inaccurate content. And because of that, and because these things are becoming much more widely available, very easy to use, they're often cheap, we can expect that they're going to lead to much more harmful misinformation. But crucially, we argue, the difference here is one of degree. It's not a difference in kind. And that means it doesn't require a whole new approach on the part of the platforms, but rather more of the same and done better. In other words, the platforms should be really taking this moment as an opportunity to double down on their moderation of harmful misinformation in general. So on the point about symmetry between AI-generated content and other content, we just don't think there's any good reason to moderate misinformation differently based on the technology that's been used to produce it. Because a post's potential for harm is independent of how it was produced. So if a post is sufficiently harmful to merit moderation in the first place, getting further information about its source makes no difference to that conclusion. Instead, we argue what platforms should focus on is enforcing justified content rules and doing so accurately. So then the question arises, what are those content rules? And this is the final slide I'll present. So we offer a three-part proposal on what we think would be a coherent misinformation policy. So the first point, where content is inaccurate, but it's not misleading, say because it's totally unrealistic, it's labeled, or it's obviously satirical, then there's no need to take it down on the basis of it being misinformation. But where the content is misleading, it should be removed if it poses a serious risk of harm. So this is kind of the top level. And then where it poses a lesser risk of harm, it should be demoted in the algorithms that determine the feeds that people see. And what's kind of crucial for the points that we're making today is that this would apply across the board of all kinds of content. It doesn't matter whether it's produced by generative AI in the end, or if it's produced by other means. Good, I think I'll stop there because I'm getting a note on time. So just remains then to say thank you for your attention and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on our proposals.
Thank you so much for that. And Doug, would you like to go next?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Yohannes. He made my presentation a little easier because he gave you a lot of context from Ethiopia. So I will try to go add a little layer to what Yohannes has been saying, that those he described the blind spots. So I'll start with a little bit of history. This is like Ethiopia's 100 or a century of history is packed in these three images. These are like the three strong leaders of Ethiopia. Until 2018, our internet access was only limited to 3%. But then this guy showed up and opened up everything. He introduced political reforms, opened up political space, which led to the emergence of hyper-partisan media outlets and expansion of media access, of course, expansion of internet access. John mentioned that we are now 24%. We are 120 million strong population. That means we are about 30 million internet users. So from 2018, so things have changed dramatically. So those is described by this typical image. As you can see here, there is dramatic increase to access to internet, social media, which led to increased polarization of media along different fault lines, mainly ethnic fault lines, but religion also is one of those dimensions that increased the presence. And so that led us to a conflict narratives. Statistically speaking, Ethiopia had, over the last 5 years since 2018, about 350 conflicts. 350 conflicts. Those conflicts are exacerbated by this access to internet. And there is different kind of conflict narratives as well. And those conflicts, the 350 conflicts were documented, broadcasted on those platforms, unmoderated, completely unmoderated by these big platforms. And those narratives include, of course, misinformation, harmful content. And one of those major conflicts was the Tigray conflict. The Tigray conflict that took hundreds, thousands of millions civilians, combatants as well. It lasted about 2 years. There is an ongoing conflict in Ethiopia's two of the biggest regions, Amhara region and Oromia region. And those conflicts are broadcasted through these mushroomed platforms. So with this context, I wanted to answer 2 questions. So how are these contents are moderated? And how are these tech companies' role described in, of course, maybe exacerbating these conflicts or helping alleviate or resolving these conflicts? So I took 3 conflicts. And of course, from those conflicts, I zoomed in into 3 different words. My methodology was like case studies, interviews with current and former content moderators, and analysis of tactics used by different activists to introduce and popularize new hate words, and how moderators are trying to use policies, content policies to moderate those. So I took one word from the Tigray conflict that I described that lasted 2 years from 2020 to 2022, the word Wayani, it's a Tigrayan word. Original meaning in Tigrinya is revolution. It's associated with TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Formerly, they were the rulers of Ethiopia until 2018. During the conflict, that word is shifted and repurposed in a popular parlance to refer to member of the Tigrayan ethnic group. But social media platforms do not have that policy to capture that evolution. And if you go and look on these terms in these platforms, TikTok, social, any of those bigger platforms in Ethiopia, they are still popular. They're still being used. They're not moderated. From my interview from content moderators, they're saying there is no policy in addressing these repurposed hateful words. And the conflict is dynamics and people are creating new words as the conflict go. And there is no policy to capture that. This is one from the Tigrayan conflict. There is another conflict in Amhara region, and Yohannes earlier described the word Neftanya. Neftanya is, the literal translation of Neftanya is rifleman, a gunman, like the musketeers kind of historical significance. So this term historically associated with the images that I have shown you at the beginning of my presentation with the ruling class, the imperial Ethiopia until 1974. But that Neftanya, the meaning has changed, evolved to refer to as particular ethnic groups, the Amhara ethnic groups. And during conflicts, activists use this term to refer to Amhara, members of Amhara ethnic groups, especially after the killing of the popular singer, Oromo singer, Ayalew in 2022, this term was popular. And if you search this term on those platforms, they're still popular. They're not moderated. And activists and other policy people also try to reach out to these platforms to look at this policy of this social media, but I don't think they have any policy toward this kind of terms. So utilization of Neftanya on Facebook, on YouTube to label the Amhara individuals is still prevalent. It's not moderated. And of course, subsequent conflicts leading to this tragic loss of 200 civilians. Of course, there is also like pogroms or escalation of conflict within ethnic community in Oromia region. Response of YouTube is not like, they're not censoring them, they're not moderating them, there is no policy that addresses this. So this is another case study that how linguistic, culturally rich or culturally laden words are not moderated. So maybe do we need some cultural term for content moderation? That's the question that I'm asking. The third one is the term Oromuma. So Oromuma it's an Oromo word. And the literal translation of Oromuma means being Oromo or Oromoness. It's one of the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. So, of course, there is an ideological underpinning to the term that scholars from that ethnic group try to deploy. But when this conflict happened, this Oromuma kind of evolved and changed into a hate term now. Oromuma becoming a mobilizing term with negative connotation, a role in fueling tension, particularly between the Amhara and Oromo ethnic groups. And content moderation policies do not address this. They don't have that policy. And add to this that they are training AI models to moderate this kind of conflicts. And AIs are, if they're not trained well on these cultural nuances, they're dumb. They sometimes take down terms that should not be taken down. sometimes they leave terms that shouldn't be allowed on the platform. So this is a blind spot that Yohannes was talking about. So these are the three terms that I have chosen from these different conflicts, and that are giving Ethiopia a lot of issues. So the content policies of these big platforms do not have any policy regarding new hate words that are emerging from this conflict. I said that there are about 350 conflicts over the last 5 years, and those conflicts have their own words. Activists, politicians have coined new hate words, and policies are not equipped to deal with this one. Challenges for platform in identifying and understanding the context of these terms is still low. As I said, AI do not address these cultural nuances. So these are the challenges that I have come across through my research. And of course, through my interview, that I don't want to put some verbatim here because my research subjects have signed NDA with these big companies, and I don't want to jeopardize their income and their way of life. So they say that these companies do not have any policy. There is no policy. There is no even discussion of capturing these dynamics in moderating those conflicts. So my question is, like, yes, we are connected. Yes, there is a lot of access to information. There is a lot of opportunity, but given the number of conflicts that have emerged since 2018 in Ethiopia, is it a time to go to the nuclear option, or is there a different policy? Do we need a cultural turn for content for moderation? Those are the questions that I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Andak. Lots of interesting threads coming from all your presentations, all your interesting talks.